Welcome to this session that's entitled Indigenization Destroys Academic Freedom. And it's part of a continuing investigation of freedom of speech, and freedom of assembly at the University of Lethbridge. This issue has been going on for some time. And of course, it will involve looking into the people that are running the University of Lethbridge. One interesting feature that will come up is the idea of DEI and all of the impact that has on freedom of speech. It affects what students and what faculty can say, and I think by extension it affects what they are allowed to think. Now, first, I want to introduce Dr. Tony Hall. My name's Dave Garratt, by the way, and I'm here as moderator. I think I'll have more to do at the end when we have some questions and answers and some discussion. So we want one person talking at a time. I'm going to introduce Dr. Hall. He came to Lethbridge in 1990 to be an assistant professor, associate professor, of Aboriginal Studies.
Native American Studies. Yeah.
Don't quote me. Yeah. He spent 26 years doing research and teaching, and then what happened to him is very similar to what happened to our featured speaker here today, which Dr. Francis Widdowson, who was at Mount Royal University in Calgary. Dr. Hall has published a couple of major works. They're here on this table. You could do some weightlifting with each of them. And he's also published hundreds of articles, one of which I was just looking at on Indigenous residential schools in Canada. He had some interesting experiences at the university, and after some court action, went back there and started what is known as globalization studies. Next September, the coming September, there will likely be a similar presentation as to this one, and the focus of that will be on Dr. Hall's case. It will focus on his experience with our local university. And he is going to introduce our featured speaker, Dr. Francis Widdowson. So, Tony?
Thank you very much. And there's some technical parts in the chronology that weren't quite right, but it's a big learning exercise for all of us. And I've been learning a lot about Dr. Widdowson, and it's quite a revelation, and it's renewing the fact that, I came here as a professor of Native American Studies. I remember when I applied for the job, Leroy Littlebear, waiting for me in the airport. You're going to know his name well by the end of today. And I'd love to see a debate between Leroy Littlebear and Dr. Francis Widdowson. When I first met Francis, I had not been following her career, and I was working on my own things, and Native American Studies was an issue I was looking at, globally, Indigenous peoples globally. In any case, I heard there was this interesting case, so I went to the event, and I can see that several people here were at the event, and it was memorable in a very upsetting way. It was not the kind of scene that you would expect to see in a university, in an institution of higher learning. It was all about spurning and silencing and trying to overpower the speaker, the invited speaker, Dr. Widdowson, who was deemed to be by the Department of Indigenous Studies, as NAS was then called, something called a residential school denier. And it seemed that the professors in liberal education, that they'd been talking about this very heretical person, and students were very revved up to make it clear that she was not welcome and that she would not be accepted if she tried to give a public presentation in the public space. Professor Viminitz, who's with us now, had invited Dr. Widdowson, and Dr. Widdowson was welcomed by the president of the university, but then had become subject to a real press of political influence, and he reneged on that invitation. Dr. Widdowson came in any case. So Helena, my wife's there, she and I were there early and not really sure what to expect. And there was a group coming around handing out buttons saying, no place for hate. So this was how it was introduced. And these were, lovely looking people, young looking people, bright looking young people who had a sense that they were on a mission to block out hate. And Dr. Widdowson became their idea of the hatred that had to be censored, that had to be contained, that had to be pushed to the edges, that had to be silenced, with like electric guitar that goes, well, yeah, if he tries to talk, with drumming and chanting, sacred chanting, which it was, I found it a little upsetting to see this sacred chanting directed in the way that it was. It was kind of a mob. It was a mob to silence a person deemed unworthy of human respect, let alone the capacity to talk in a public forum about a subject of her research, and that she has been articulate and facing a lot of persecution as a result of her ideas. I find some of Dr. Widdowson's ideas troubling to me. I guess you could see me going through PhD. I was very intent on the Aboriginal issues, that it seemed that this country, with all its promise, was not doing a good job with the sort of foundational issue of how we relate to Indigenous peoples. And lo and behold, I worked my way through a PhD. I got the PhD. I got a job in Laurentian University in Sudbury teaching Native Studies. And I got the call from Lethbridge, from from Leroy Littlebear, to join Native American Studies, which to me was the pinnacle. It was a great appointment, and I moved with my family, and here I am in Lethbridge to this day. So this episode has resonated, and Francis and I had dinner and met together the next night, and Francis was with Albert Howard, and Albert Howard is a big part of this story. Albert Howard is Francis's husband. She met him when she was around 25, bright-eyed and bushy-tailed and gorgeous and ready for action, and they teamed up in Yellowknife. And Francis had graduated from University of Victoria in political science. And so Albert Howard, I think, had a big influence on the fact that they became kind of socialists together, even dialectical materialist. Even there was influence of Trotsky, and there was this vibrant milieu of a very active middle-class professional working scene in Yellowknife, mostly doing Native programs. And people were making good livings, and it seemed from that perspective to be kind of a good operation. But what was the effect on the people being administered to? and were dependencies being reified, being supported. So there came to be this concept that became her, her first major book that was discussed a lot, Aboriginal industry. And the idea that there has come to be a very large, well-funded, and elaborate set of businesses, and some private and some public, and lawyers and consultants. And let's not forget the make-work projects in the prisons, because a lot of Indigenous peoples fill the prisons, especially in Western Canada. And that's a make-work project. A lot of well-paying jobs are generated, and generated by some of the stark social issues that we see, walking around Lethbridge. It's pretty clear that there is a disproportionate number of the homeless people on the streets. Not all of them, but many of them are Native people. And this is not just unique to Lethbridge. So what happened? What's going on? So Frances did her PhD after she left Yellowknife. I think after you left Yellowknife.
Yes.
And at York with Leo Panitch, who is sort of Trotskyite in his orientation. And the focus was on the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples. Now, by this time, I was ensconced in Native American studies, and, I got a couple of contracts writing chapters for the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples. It was a very big enterprise. And I did end up writing an article about it called Blind Spot, which became the title of the book in which it appeared, where I began to question the Royal Commission. And so Frances was able to write a PhD thesis. Meanwhile, the book Disrobing the Aboriginal Industry, discussions, that book was done before the PhD and then finished after the PhD. And that has generated a great deal of discussion. And it's been very polarizing. And there's no doubt that Frances Widdowson is a polarizing figure. People speak very highly of her and very appreciatively, saying politically incorrect things that are sort of seen as not with the party line, not with the government flows of money, not with the way the middle class develops itself. In fact, she's condemning it in ways that some people find very objectionable. And I in reading reviews, I found my friend Peter Kulczycki at Winnipeg writing about Frances in a very negative light, almost saying, you're not worthy to really be a good Marxist. Peter Kulczycki published in the Canadian Dimension, which I published in a lot. Saigonic, communist, runs that journal. This has continued. Then came more books, separate but unequal, Aboriginal knowledge and economic development. And I want to, humanize her story a bit, because at the University of Lethbridge and in the way she's written about it in the mainstream media, you just utter this phrase, residential school denier, and that sums her up. That's all you need to know. She's a person with complexities. Interestingly, it's more the right-wing conservative branch of our political spectrum, our leadership cod, that has embraced Frances's work. And so, recently in December of 2023, this book, Grave Error, How the Media Misled Us and the Truth About Residential Schools, forward by Conrad Black. Now, many Canadians will know Conrad Black as a very prominent Canadian, a sort of Zionist media mogul. He used to own the Jerusalem Post. He started the National Post. But here he is writing the foreword along with Tom Flanagan, who has been very supportive of Francis Widdowson. Tom Flanagan essentially invented what became the Harper government. And it was an unusual thing that the Canadian government should move away from the Laurentian area of Ottawa, Montreal, and Toronto and kind of get a base in Calgary. And it was really Tom Flanagan, a professor at the University of Calgary. I mean, his students adored him. Ezra Levant, Daniel Smith, Stephen Harper. He really, his students all became prominent, and he was embracing the social credit heritage of Alberta minus the anti-Semitism, because the social credit talk about bankers a lot. And so his idea was to invite David Frum and Ezra Levant to a conference in 1996 aimed at reinventing conservatism, away from progressive conservative to not what we now have, the Conservative Party of Canada. So since the University of Lethbridge event, Francis is now widely acknowledged as a kind of pioneer of the 16 authors in here, representing a wide spectrum, very professional people, former judges, editors, journalists, well-known journalists. And she's now being recognized as one of the people that scouted out the fact that in 2021, the claim that mass graves had been discovered at the Kamloops Residential School was not really supported by the evidence. There was ground-penetrating radar showing there's something buried in the apple orchard, but it's been how long now? A number of years, and we really don't have any evidence that this is really true. Now, of course, the residential schools have been a long-time source of a lot of controversy, and very bad things happen in those schools. In some cases, in other ways, some people liked their experience in those schools and are happy for the education they were able to receive as a result. But this is a new concept that if there are mass graves, there must be mass murder. And so this sort of changes the whole picture of Canadian history if this is how the Indigenous people were being treated. And so we have the phenomena that the government of Canada, the Parliament of Canada, all the media, the New York Times, the Washington Post, many, many powerful instruments have glammed on to the position that Canada has mass graves and there was mass murder to fill these mass graves. Where did the bodies come from? And yet no evidence has really been reported. It's not to say that who knows what might be discovered in the future. So this is a long way to introduce Francis, but Francis has become a very, very major figure. And we are really in a moment of contributing to history, because this is Lethbridge, where an event which I think has become notorious, which indicates there's something really wrong when a university devotes itself to blocking out speech, to preventing discussion and diverse opinion being expressed in a civil way, when this civility is replaced with a kind of ruthless cruelty. The person who ended up doing a lot of speaking was the security person. And Francis and a little group around her had to be kind of guided into tunnels and taken away from what was becoming a dangerous situation. There was a lot of talking from people who decided that they would describe their grievances and who really owns the land and this kind of thing. There's tapes of this. So here we are revisiting this issue at the University of Lethbridge. And then there came a month ago, or shortly, a little bit over that amount of time at Quesnel, a kind of book burning exercise where there was an effort to make the mayor resign because his wife had been seen distributing this contraband, trafficking in books. We haven't seen a formal book burning, but there is the sentiment out there, that this will be seen as a seditious act of us talking about this, of presenting a forum to our primary speaker, Dr. Francis Widdowson.
Thank you very much, Tom. Thank you. Thank you. And thanks, Dave Garratt, for agreeing to moderate these proceedings. And as well, we have helpers on Zoom to deal with the question and answer period, which will happen afterwards. Scott McCluskey and Trevor Tomash are going to help us with the Zoom situation, and Stephanie is helping with the live streaming. So it's been quite a group effort to get here today. I'm amazed that it's all come together with all the technological moving parts. But thank you very much, everyone, for coming today. And this is a very, very important case, the University of Lethbridge, because although many people in Canada are perhaps not aware of the University of Lethbridge, we are suing, Paul Vemenitz, Jonah Pickle, a student, and me are suing the University of Lethbridge for violating our charter rights. And I think there's a good chance we will win that case. But if we do not win that case, this is a terrible precedent it's going to set for universities. But even if we do not win that case, I think that the public attention that we have obtained about the Lethbridge situation, the complete destruction of academic freedom that has happened at that institution, starting with the case of Anthony Hall in 2016, is really a canary in the coal mine for universities in Canada. So the time to fight is now, and we are marshaling forces to expose what is happening at universities through an examination of the University of Lethbridge case. So we've had a number of events already about the University of Lethbridge and what happened on February 1st, 2023. But what I would like to do is sort of go a bit deeper into some of the materials that got released. I believe it was in August of last year. So as part of the court case, which is going to be happening next year, we were able to get disclosure from the University of Lethbridge, where they released 260 pages of emails from the University of Lethbridge, which showed what was happening behind the scenes between about I guess it was about January 27th and January 30th or January 31st. And what it was all the pressure, tremendous amounts of pressure were being placed on the University of Lethbridge. And I wanted to just discuss some of those emails with respect to the University of Lethbridge case. But before I get into discussing those emails and what was the content of them in a very general way, you can look at them in more detail. They're available as the certified record of proceeding, which is on the wokeacademy.info website. So www.wokeacademy.info under the posting certified record of proceeding. That shows you the entire 260 pages, but I just wanted to talk very generally about the arguments. But before I get into that, I just wanted to briefly outline a few terms so that we can start off with a common understanding with respect to academic freedom, what is meant by academic freedom, and also the terms indigenization and decolonization. What do those terms mean? Because it's my contention that indigenization, which then morphs into decolonization, that is one of the main reasons why academic freedom was destroyed at the University of Lethbridge. So I wanted to just talk briefly about that before I get into actually what Paul Vemenitz has called the Widdowson affair, which was the cancellation of my talk on February 1st, 2023, And then I can talk about the emails from the 15 professors, which are publicly available. And then an important statement that was put out by the Department of Indigenous Studies, which, although it is one page, I think it really summarizes everything that we need to know about indigenization. It's a very clear example of what we are dealing with. And then finally, I wanted to just end with a discussion of why academic freedom is important. One of the most disturbing things about what's happening in universities now is that the public doesn't seem to care about what's going on in universities. And I don't know whether it's because it seems to be quite intellectual and esoteric, not really pertinent to concerns that are happening on a daily basis, or whether they're just so fed up with the absolute nonsense that many professors are spouting these days. I don't know what it is, but if we lose our universities, we are going to have serious problems as a society. And I think the public needs to really realize that, and then join with professors like me and Tony Hall and Paul Viminetz and the Society for Academic Freedom and Scholarship to fight back against the forces at work which are really trying to destroy this very, very important institution. So, in terms of academic freedom, which I just wanted to talk briefly about and just explain what it means and why it's so important, there's been a number of definitions that have been developed, and it really started at the beginning of the, I guess it was the beginning of the 19th century, where there were a lot of problems with corporations trying to control the ideas that were discussed at universities. And what happened is the American Association of University Professors in the United States and the Canadian Association of University Teachers in Canada had a number of conferences on this and came up with a very robust definition of academic freedom, which covers not only research and teaching, but also what's called extramural and intramural academic freedom. So your ability to criticize the university at which you work, that's supposed to be protected, and as well as outside expression. So expression when you're talking to the media or when you're on social media, those kinds of things are all supposed to be protected as well. And the reason why these protections are so robust is because you need to have a lot of latitude to try to pursue the truth in a number of different venues. And it might be slightly outside of your area of expertise because that allows for cross-fertilization to occur if you explore an idea that you're not, completely, you've done massive research on, but it's going to help you to understand the area in which you're examining. So the idea is that you should have a right to state what you believe to be true. And this should happen, and this is from the UNESCO definition that was developed in 1997, which the Canadian Association of University Teachers was involved with constructing, without constriction by prescribed doctrine. So that means that there should not be a predetermined idea that you have to align yourself with in the university. You should be able to challenge all ideas within the universities without having the university tell you this is the right way to think about something. And then there should be no institutional censorship. So there should be no university administrators canceling talks, for example. And so we can see how at the University of Lethbridge, there has been a complete violation of the principles of academic freedom because, as we will see, indigenization is actually a prescribed doctrine. So it's a predetermined view of how you should think about Indigenous issues. And as a result of that prescribed doctrine, that gave justification for the censorship, which was the rescinding of space. That's what happened, was the rescinding of space with respect to my talk. So this occurred because of indigenization. And this raises the question of what indigenization is and its fellow traveler, what's now called decolonization. And so, as Dave Garratt mentioned in his introduction, this is related to what's called diversity, inclusion, and equity programs, which is a complex topic in its own right. But indigenization is an aspect of diversity, inclusion, and equity types of initiatives, and it's part of inclusion, what's called inclusion. And the argument is that Indigenous people have been historically excluded from universities. And there's been a lot of discriminatory treatment of Indigenous people. And that's something we should recognize. No one is denying that there has been a terrible history of exclusion. So it has been proposed that there should be mechanisms developed so that Indigenous people can feel welcome in the university setting. And that's a good thing, is that, Indigenous people should feel welcome in the university setting. And there should be a number of programs that do this. And this is the positive side of indigenization. The problem is when that inclusion is developed through a lowering of standards for Indigenous people. And we've seen that happening in universities. All sorts of changes to various programs so that Indigenous people either don't have to meet the same entrance requirements as other students, professors, you have alternate tenure requirements, even proposals that they shouldn't have to write things down because Indigenous culture is an oral culture and therefore writing is not something that should be a requirement. These sorts of things, which is not helpful at all, because not only does it provide a lower standard of teaching and research for Indigenous people, it also creates a problem of the quality of the education in general in universities. And how we've seen this the most prominent initiative, which has resulted in this lowering of standards, is the promotion of what's called Indigenous ways of knowing. And the idea is that a way of knowing should create knowledge. So you have a method of some kind that allows you to develop knowledge within the university. But what we find with Indigenous ways of knowing is it's things like revelation. Various spiritual beliefs are promoted as a way of acquiring knowledge, or just the general memories that Indigenous people have, which in terms of this book, Grave Error, which Anthony Hall was talking about, in terms of the Kamloops case and the 215 anomalies that were found there, in addition to the GPR, there's a number of Indigenous people who remember stories about Indigenous people being buried in that apple orchard. And that is not a form of evidence that can be verified. So that, if you're going to say that the way of knowing, there's Indigenous ways of knowing that has resulted in this quote unquote knowledge of 215 children being buried in that apple orchard, that is not a rigorous way of determining whether that's the case or not. So to insist that this must be incorporated into the curriculum is going to have very serious negative effects on the university and the knowledge that's produced in the university. So indigenization could be positive, but it's often been turned into something which results in a lowering of standards. We've seen things become even worse than that in the last few years, however, with the morphing of indigenization into what's called decolonization, which is not about adding Indigenous perspectives and so on. It's about removing those views that Indigenous activists find to be offensive. And that is really the serious problem that we're facing. And in my case, as I'll show shortly, because of my views on whether or not the residential schools were genocidal, and I argue that they are not. They had many, many problems, caused a lot of harm. There was abuse in many residential schools, but to say genocide is to say the intentional extermination of a group of people, and that's not what was intended by the Indigenous residential schools. And also this idea of the remains of 215 children. I'm challenging that. I'm saying there's no evidence to support that being the case. These two positions, as we'll see, are found to be very offensive at the University of Lethbridge. And although I think that they are very valid positions, and I have a lot of many arguments to make to support them, it is argued that I should be excluded from the University of Lethbridge so that Indigenous activists can feel safe, comfortable, secure at that university. And that is not how a university should be operating in society today. And it's going to cause terrible problems for all universities if we are going to accept this way of proceeding. So that gives you a bit of an understanding of what academic freedom is, how it really comes up against how indigenization and then decolonization have come to be understood, because it involves indigenization has become a prescribed doctrine. So it is a view that you must accept, the views that are put forth by Indigenous activists, and that provides justification for cancellation, which is what happened in terms of February 1st. And so both constriction by prescribed doctrine occurred, as well as institutional censorship. Those two things occurred on February 1st, when Paul Viminitz invited me on, I think it was in November, to come and give one public lecture, and that was not on the residential schools. The lecture was on how wokeism, which is identity politics that has become totalitarian, the totalitarian form of identity politics. I was arguing that it threatens academic freedom, was my argument. I mean, it was, in fact, proven to be the case, because I could not even discuss that at the University of Lethbridge. So obviously, wokeism does threaten academic freedom, because wokeism was the reason why I was not able to be able to give the talk, how wokeism threatens academic freedom. Anyway, President Mann, who he rescinded space for my lecture because of all the pressure. And the other thing that happened was that Vice Provost students, Kathleen Massey, I gave 2 lectures in Paul Viminitz's classes on whether or not universities should foster respect for Indigenous ways of knowing, and I was arguing that they should not officially. If individual professors want to teach that, that's one thing, but universities should not be developing this prescribed doctrine on this topic. Anyway, Massey sent out an email to all Paul Viminitz's students saying that they may be excused from my lecture if these classes will cause harm to you. And that view was backed up by the University of Lethbridge Faculty Association, which is very, very shocking that a faculty association would accept that. Both of those instances were a violation of Paul Viminitz's academic freedom, because Viminitz should have the ability to invite speakers to give lectures, and that was denied to him. And as well, it's up to Viminitz to decide whether his students should attend a lecture or not some administrator sending an email, which he did not even know about, to his students saying that they didn't have to attend. So those were 2 direct violations of Viminitz's academic freedom because of this prescribed doctrine of indigenization, which then, of course, morphs into decolonization. The reason why the public lecture, the space for that, was rescinded was because of all the pressure that was happening behind the scenes. And we just found out about this in, I guess it was August or September of last year, when we got the disclosure because of the court case. And there are 15 professors who should just hang their heads in shame. They are totally acting against the academic mission of their universities. And it's quite shocking to read these emails. And in these emails, and this is all available on the wokeacademy.info site, as I mentioned, there were two arguments that were made as to why the talk should be canceled. The first argument was that my lecture was not academic, and they were claiming that I didn't use evidence to make my arguments. So my arguments were these kinds of crazy, hate-mongering types of views that really had no place in an academic institution, which is absolute nonsense. And these people don't even read what I write anyway, so they don't even know what I'm arguing. It's comical. It would be comical if it weren't so tragic. That was sort of the minority position. The majority position was that although my views might be academic, there are higher values at the University of Lethbridge than academic freedom, which is a surprising statement in its own right, that the academic mission of the university wouldn't be the highest value at that institution. And there are three values that trump academic freedom. And these are protection from harm. So students should be protected from harm, and hearing my words spoken would cause them psychological harm. In fact, sometimes even re-traumatize them in terms of the trauma that they're experiencing. Hate speech is another argument that's made, that my views are hate speech and are therefore illegal in Canada. Peter Bowl wrote a very, very good piece in the Society for Academic Freedom and Scholarship newsletter in February 2024, where he dissects the claim about hate speech that was made by Carolyn Hodes, who is the most significant professor at University of Lethbridge in terms of the arguments that were being made. Many professors just sort of threw off a few lines here and there in their emails. Carolyn Hodes has seriously doubled down on her arguments in the journal, appropriately titled Feminist Asylum. And it certainly is an asylum, because it has completely irrational views that are being expressed in that article. And then we have finally the main other value, which I think is very, very prominent at the University of Lethbridge, and that is what has happened over the last 10 years or longer is building relationship with Indigenous communities. So the university has really taken this on, and they've gone into the communities, and they've hired a whole bunch of Indigenous activists within administration. And because the Indigenous activists got upset about the talk that I was going to be giving, it would need to be canceled. Otherwise, those relationships would suffer. And that was a very prominent argument that was made in those emails. So that's in a very general sense what those emails said. But I highly encourage people to look on the wokeacademy.info site at the certified record of proceeding, which goes through about 260 pages of these emails. It's also very interesting to look at how the administrators responded to those emails. Did they say, hey, we're an academic institution, maybe you should consider and go to this talk and see what the arguments are? No, there was all sorts of placating and pandering to these highly anti-intellectual arguments that were being made. So these violations of academic freedom, which were the rescinding of space for my talk and the Kathleen Massey email to Viminit's students, why did these violations occur? Well, it's pretty apparent from the emails that it was because of the commitment to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action. And how, you're saying, well, isn't it about truth, and isn't reconciliation about, having sort of the interaction between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples to find a better way forward? Well, truth and reconciliation don't mean what you think that they mean. Okay, so truth means relative truth. So the truth that someone believes. So what they believe to be true, if it's an Indigenous activist, that is truth. And reconciliation is basically listening to the demands of Indigenous activists. So there's no kind of back and forth and trying to figure things out. That's not happening. It's like you should submit to these arguments that are being made. And this has been pursued on a number of different levels. And Anthony Hall mentioned Leroy Littlebear. Leroy Littlebear is a huge figure at the University of Lethbridge, and he's been involved in the Native American studies initially from its inception in the 1970s. And he is basically a Blackfoot politician who is in the university and uses his position, his academic position, to put forward the activist position. And he has been involved in many initiatives at the University of Lethbridge. One of the most important early on, I believe that was in 2013, was the Blackfoot and First Nations, Métis, and Inuit Handbook that was produced, and that developed the territorial land acknowledgement. So that's in that handbook. More recently, he's been involved with what's called the Navigator 11 program, which was put into place with MasterCard. So it's a very corporate initiative trying to improve Indigenous participation in various corporate activities. Anyway, this latest development resulted in many Indigenous activists being hired in administration. And in the emails that were released, there's a whole bunch of discussion that was going on between Leroy Littlebear and the administration and this program, the 6 activists that were hired on this program, arguing that my talk should be shut down. So these activists played a significant role. Anyway, this territorial acknowledgement that was developed in 2013 is very, very important. And I have highlighted the sentence, or part of the sentence, that was used to sort of put forward the prescribed doctrine, and then that was used as the justification for the cancellation on February 1st. So we honor the Blackfoot people and their traditional ways of knowing. And that sounds very innocuous on its face, because people would say, just reading that, well, why shouldn't we, Indigenous people who've been here for thousands of years, we should really honor their place within Alberta, within Canada, and what's the harm in that? Well, it depends on how that's interpreted. And as we're going to see, it was interpreted in a way to prevent me from speaking on February 1st. So this appeared in the Department of Indigenous Studies statement. So the territorial acknowledgement appeared. I'll get to that shortly. But this is the first part of this statement, which was released, I believe, a few days before I was supposed to speak. And the whole department, so everyone signed on, supposedly. So a number of professors in that department, they basically denounced me as a department. And the reason why they denounced me was because I did not accept the TRC's classification of the residential school system as genocide. That was the first reason. And secondly, I disputed the veracity of the unmarked graves. So that is very strange to happen at an academic institution. A whole department to come out to say that they're going to denounce me. I have my reasons for why I don't think the residential schools were genocidal. Same with the most prominent residential school historian, James Miller, who also argues the same. So I don't understand why that view should be prohibited at a university. And in terms of the veracity of the unmarked graves, I don't dispute the veracity of the unmarked graves. There are many unmarked graves in cemeteries. That is the unmarked graves. What there is no evidence for is clandestine burials. So burials which are done secretly because of some foul play which had unfolded and needed to be hidden. We have not one clandestine burial that has been substantiated in the across the country. And we need evidence of the clandestine burials. And what you see happen is when you have the conversation start about the clandestine burials, then you get diverted into a discussion of the remains that exist in cemeteries. No one should be surprised to find human remains in a cemetery. That is what cemeteries are about. And what's happened is the markers that were put over those graves have deteriorated. So now you have things like the Cowess's case, whereby, the whole cemetery has basically been incorporated into what appears to be a soccer field. And that's where you saw Prime Minister Trudeau kneeling with a teddy bear. He was kneeling over what was basically an abandoned cemetery, which has been known for decades. It's not a surprise, but it got spun to indicate that it was clandestine in some way, which it was not. Cowess's, there's no even hint that those are clandestine burials. And then this is the second part of the Indigenous Studies statement, right, is that this territorial land acknowledgement, which has the sentence about honoring the Blackfoot people and their traditional ways of knowing, the Indigenous Studies Department gives us their interpretation of what that means. And that means that you must have a commitment from all faculty to ensure that Indigenous histories are represented safely. What does it mean to represent a history safely? Well, that means you shouldn't have a view of that history which is going to be upsetting to Indigenous activists. And that is not how academic institutions operate. Many times we have people who are invested in a particular view of history, and they become very upset when someone challenges that. That is the whole purpose of an academic institution. And then there's all sorts of claims about having to stand with Indigenous students and faculty, and that, welcoming and acknowledging we have a commitment. So they're really putting a lot of pressure on faculty members to reject views with which they disagree. This is absolutely contrary to academic freedom, because academic freedom, you are not supposed to have this prescribed doctrine forced upon you. And this is exactly what the Department of Indigenous Studies at the University of Lethbridge is doing. So this entire statement is just an incredibly good example of what happens when a university becomes indigenized, is that you have all these activist pressures which are placed on the discussion of ideas. So that gives you a sense of how indigenization destroyed academic freedom at the University of Lethbridge. And now the question is, why should we care about that? Why is that just an absolutely terrible thing to happen at the University of Lethbridge? And things are happening, maybe not as in an extreme way in other institutions, but the same kinds of pressures are being mounted on those institutions. And the Supreme Court, in a case called McKinney versus the University of Guelph, just does kind of stress why this is important, is that in universities, we need to have the free and fearless search for knowledge and the propagation of ideas, and this is essential to our continuance as a lively democracy. So if we do not have this in universities, we are going to have serious problems as a society, and I think we are starting to see that a little bit. And with respect to my case, the allegations about genocide, this is a very serious business. If Canada was engaged in genocide, we need to recognize that, and we need to figure out what to do about that. But if we did not engage in genocide, then that's a whole nother conversation. So we need to figure out what the situation is, and we don't know what that is yet, because we have all these clampdowns on the discussions that are happening across the country, and then the veracity of the unmarked graves. It is May 25th today. 2 days from now, on May 27th, we come to the third anniversary of the announcement by the Kamloops Band that the remains of 215 children had been found. That's what they said 3 years ago. At the time, I thought this was just a mistake because, ground penetrating radar, no one knows anything about that. And, maybe it's, people just misunderstood. This is looking less and less likely. It is likely fraud, massive fraud that has been perpetrated against the Canadian public because millions, I believe it is about $300 million, has now been distributed to try to do further investigations. The Kamloops Band, at the very least, needs to release the Beaulieu GPR report. So there's a report that was done on the GPR. They have kept that secret. That report was funded by the Canadian Heritage Department. We need that report released so we can look at the methodology that was used and whether Sarah Beaulieu stated in that report that the remains of 215 children had been found. My guess, she did not say that. And if she did say that, there's serious incompetence that occurred in that report. Second thing, besides the pursuit of truth, which is being undermined, professionals, doctors, engineers, teachers, all the people who make things work in our society, they're not going to work anymore because then they will not have the knowledge to be able to understand how to provide healthcare, provide education, provide engineering, whatever needs to be done. That's going to be a serious problem. In fact, indigenization is an attack on the merit principle in universities. And finally, buttressing democracy. Universities are the first kind of line of defense against the increasing autocratic tendencies that are going on. As Anthony Hall mentioned, I went to Quesnel April 2nd to ask questions at their meeting after all the city council had denounced this book without having read it. And I wanted to ask them questions about that. And I encountered an unbelievable breakdown of local democracy in the city of Quesnel, and you can watch it. It's on YouTube, that meeting. It was just a disintegration of democratic principles, and that's what we're going to see throughout the wider society if we don't start fighting back right now and insisting that our universities protect academic freedom. Thank you very much.
Awesome. We are going to do this. Yep.
And I should just mention about the question and answer. We were discussing that. Unfortunately, Dave was not on the call. We have two helpers, Trevor Tomesh and Scott McCluskey, who are going to field the question and answers. Oh, we're going to have a commentary, though, first, aren't we?
Yes.
Sorry.
Yes, we are.
I jumped the gun there just because Tony was presenting.
Yeah. Okay, me again. This concept of academic freedom, if I put up a poster and put it in the streets, worry about academic freedom, I don't think people would notice it very much. It's definitely related to free speech, the right of free speech, but it has a much more elaborate role in the university. And I'm going to go as far as to say that any institution calling itself a university without academic freedom cannot be a credible university. You know, you need to debate things. People need to feel secure, saying things that might be unpopular, might be unorthodox, might be something that people have never heard before. We need places to discuss things, and it's not just a matter of who's the most popular and whose voice is going to prevail. You think if you're a professor and you come up with some finding that might disrupt a whole industry as it exists because it provides some new approach to making things or servicing things, the people in that industry are going to want to fight to protect their existing powers, economic viability. So there's all kinds of formula, there's all kinds of possibilities that by doing research, you're going to offend people in power. You're going to offend people with a lot of money and political clout. And so little by little, this idea that you have to have
protection for academic freedom.
Now we with the coronavirus, where the government decided we're going to have lockdowns. And it wasn't one government doing this. All the governments were doing the same wrong things simultaneously, doing the same anti-science things. Oh, we're going to wear masks, which are not good for you. We're going to not do ivermectin. We're going to do mandatory jabs. Think of the University of Lethbridge. Mike Mon has dictated that in order to be a student or a faculty member at the University of Lethbridge, you had to take 2 shots, which were not tested, which don't even seem in light of what we know now to have anything to do with a virus. These were about genetic modification, mRNA, lipid nanoparticle. There was no debate in the universities. So it's necessary if we have a problem in society with free speech, with being able to disagree about things with civility. But that's what we have universities for. So if you have universities but without academic freedom, what do you have? You have a place where political cronies get together and give each other favors and contracts and scratch each other's backs. You don't have a credible forum to decide what is true. And sometimes the things that are true are not going to be popular in the first instance or not seem even familiar. Or so this academic freedom, I want to stand for that. And, I'm not here to be an advocate for Francis or not, or one way or the other. But I am here to be an advocate for academic freedom, as is Francis. And that's what I see is a big problem in all the universities. And, this discussion of genocide is happening all over the world right now. And you will be very familiar with the reason that word has such furor around it. It's so volatile. So this concept of traditional ways of knowledge, from reading about Frances in her days in Yellowknife, there was a time where a new diamond mine, BPH, they were wanting to get Aboriginal involvement in their project and permission for their project. And so this concept of traditional environmental knowledge became very much prominent. And, well, what is that? Is it something that is sort of like a ribbon that you put on it with an Aboriginal design on the mine, on the diamond mine, and then it looks like you're doing the appropriate thing? So this question of the Aboriginal voice, like Leroy Little Bear has devoted a lot of his career to discussing what he calls Aboriginal science. Is science one thing? Like, there's rules for deciding what can be proven and what can't be proven and what the patterns are? Or is it a relative kind of thing that all societies have their approach to science? And, these are big questions. And, one thing I watched when I was there was this growing emphasis on Aboriginal science. And I have to say, sometimes you find yourself saying, well, where's the beef? Yeah, you can have the physicists come in and say, well, I'm doing quantum theory, and it reminds me, when I hear this Blackfoot story, it reminds me of that. It's kind of similar. But I think that's, Francis has been very pressing on that issue. And it's an important issue. And it's also important that we open ourselves to the reality that, say, in medicine, a lot of important patents come from people going into the Amazon and looking what the Indians use to cure things, getting a patent on it, taking it back and, getting rich. And Indigenous peoples have been cut out of the action in some of their actual indigenous knowledge. These are complex issues. I'm really looking forward to the discussion. This genocide word, the genocide word, it isn't a very old word. It was invented in 1944 by a person called Raphael Lemkin, and he was in Eastern Europe. He's Polish, sort of a jurist, and he was noticing as Germany became increasingly powerful, not only within Germany, but throughout Europe, that there were policies. And he was looking at largely cultural genocide, that certain groups of people, their libraries were being shut down, their theaters were being shut down, their schools were being shut down. And this was a way to favor some nationalities over other nationalities, or at least that's how he explained it in his book. He writes his book in 1944 and somehow shoots his way to New York and becomes the author of the Genocide Convention. So he actually invents the term, and you have to wonder if there was some arrangement going on here, that he invents the term and then suddenly appears as the main technician at the United Nations when it's just being formed, and he comes up with a convention, the Genocide Convention, which is being discussed a great deal now with respect to the government of Israel and Netanyahu and Hamas leadership. Actually, the ICC is not using the word genocide, but the International Criminal Court is. I do believe that genocide is a pretty powerful idea, that Canada isn't in a isolation. There's a place called the Western Hemisphere, where in 1492 there were Indigenous peoples everywhere, and their way of life prevailed. And then the Spanish came, and the Portuguese came, and the French came, and the British came, and it was pretty clear that very quickly the idea developed that this Western Hemisphere is going to be a place to receive immigrants. And the old Aboriginal way of life is not going to prevail. People are not going to learn the Aboriginal languages and learn to be Indians. That Indian people have been pushed to the margins in a hemisphere that since 1492, I think, could be described as the scene of an intergenerational genocide. And for my part, I don't see the genocide discussion as being over because we can't prove what happened at the Kamloops residential school. I think it's an important idea. I did write, this was my last peer-reviewed article. I was long since out of Native American studies, but I took an interest in the residential school issues. And what I saw at the University of Lethbridge, as I was looking into what happened vis-a-vis Francis, was a very low-level discussion about what the case of the matter is. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission was well-funded. An Aboriginal judge led it, and they came up with the idea that cultural genocide has taken place in Canada in these residential schools. And cultural genocide is a real thing. It's an important thing. Raphael Lemkin thought it was an important thing, the inventor of the word, but it's not a judiciable crime. The crime itself is in a very particular place. It's a bunch of text that is about this long. It's, just a very few words. And the definition of what genocide is given, and Israel is being charged by the ICJ for 4 of the 5 points. The 5th point says forcefully moving the children from one group to another group is genocidal. And that is what happened in Canada. And we can debate about how much compulsion there was, but after 1920, there was compulsion. You have to go to school. And And is genocide, do we just talk about after 1948 because the law didn't exist until then? Or do we read back genocide into history because obviously the process is as old as the history of humankind? So in my view, the thing to do would be, as I express in this paper here, go to the United Nations, international law, and let's work it out. And, there's similar issues coming up in Australia, different parts of the world. Maybe the United Nations is the place to deal with this. But they didn't do that so far. Murray Sinclair and the bunch, they took the money and they came up with the moderate statement that cultural genocide exists. And somehow now they're transforming it into full-fledged genocide. We'll just use the word genocide, which is against the law. It's against an international law. It's the Genocide Convention of 1948. And in my view, we fulfill that. And so I think I'm more extreme than the people at the University of Lethbridge who are, just pretending that the findings of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission are about genocide. No, it's about cultural genocide. So just to finish, I want to say, this DIE, this diversity, inclusiveness, and equity, this DIE, which is the policy of MIT is dropping it. People, little by little, they're dropping it. You no longer, when you put your application in for a job, have to tell all about your racial identity and everything where it's being dropped. So did Francis Widdowson get diversity? Is like just skin complexion? Is that what diversity is? We've got a variety of skin shades. Diversity is also to do with ideas, religious orientations, ideological orientations. And the Francis Widdowson's, her view of these things are part of a diverse array of opinions and theses on these subjects. Was she included? No, she was excluded, and almost violently so, almost aggressively so, forcefully so. She was, there was an inclusiveness and an equity. Well, if we're going to have quotas, how many Caribbeans do you have? How many trans do you have? If we're going to do it that way, what happens to meritocracy? And isn't meritocracy supposed to be important? So I'm just going to finish by saying at this point that it's a long story, but I am Professor Emeritus at the University of Lethbridge. I am part of the faculty, and I am speaking to you from within the University of Lethbridge. And actually, I have this title, and it's got this word in it called Emeritus. I got through my career. I got to the end of it, full professor, and that made me Professor Emeritus. So what I want to do is develop this investigation, of which my own case is one part. Who knows what's hiding in the woodworks at the University of Lethbridge? And University of Lethbridge is, part of a larger system, and universities all over the world are in chaos right now. And we're not doing well in, diversity discussion, civil discussion of things. So I just want to note that, when we talk about the administration, Mike Mann says this, Mike Mann says that, there's something called the Board of Governors. There's an administration, and when Mike Mann writes to me and says, you have to do this and leave, and you're going to be a trespasser, and you can't use this and that, and he's acting on behalf of the Board of Governors. And I tried to connect with the Board of Governors, and especially Terry Whitehead, who is now the Chancellor. And they have one email, governance@uleth.ca. That's the way you reach them. Who are these Board of Governors? As I say, they act in the name of the university. What are we, the faculty? Are we just employees? Somebody signing our check? No, we're supposed to be involved in the governance of the university. So this idea of getting some accountability, there's nobody here from, the University of Lethbridge at all. This criticism can be ignored. I mean, they've got the government money coming into them, and they can ask other agencies for money. And what happens if the Board of Governors says, well, we're going to refuse to take seriously our responsibility as the fiduciary of academic freedom. We need to get money, and we've got people willing to contribute as long as they can control parts of the curriculum, as long as they have a say over who gets fired. And how can academic freedom be sustained in that? So I'm thinking there needs to be an outside investigation of the University of Lethbridge. This is part of a process that we could see as Alberta-wide, and that I want to stick with this. I'm Professor Emeritus. What does that mean? It means, well, this is a service to my university. I put many years of my life into it. I want the best for my university. I want to see that university get back on track. And why not take this stage of my life and, put a priority on this? So I'm kind of making this announcement. This hasn't been part of the discussion up until now. It's the first time I brought it up. And thank you very much. And thank you, Francis, for your wonderful presentation.
Definitely. David, let's talk to you.
Well, I feel encouraged by what I've heard here today. It was over 2 years ago, I went to the University of Lethbridge to hear a talk that I had been told would occur from Dr. Francis Widdowson. I was curious about the whole residential school situation, and I thought that I would get to hear about it and learn something. For some reason, I didn't trust what the CBC had been telling me. But when I went there, I was in shock. I think I was stunned for several days after going to hear Dr. Widdowson speak. There were 700 kids in the school atrium screaming and yelling and pounding on drums and things so that she wouldn't be allowed to speak. Well, I heard her speak today, and I am very appreciative of that. And I've come to realize how much we need the university. We've come through the past few years, those of us who have survived, and it was a time when small businesses were closed, and many of those small businesses have gone bankrupt. It was a time when churches were closed and preachers were thrown in jail. And we need a university, and we need professors to stand up and speak to that. And if all of the universities are in the back pocket of the clowns that want to turn business over to the Costcos and Walmarts and superstores, where they can add billions to the billions they already have, and small businesses go broke and small churches shut down, we can't rely on government. It was our provincial government that allowed this to happen. We need some thinkers. We need some people who can argue freely together to come up with ideas and to stand against the tyranny that we've been experiencing. And now we're open to comments. There are folks watching on Zoom, and you can raise your hand and you will get recognized. You can ask your question. And we have a bunch of good citizens here today, good citizens who I think want to do something. So you can make your comment and you can ask questions of Dr. Widdowson or Dr. Hall. You might want to direct your question to one of them or leave it open to either to respond. Any questions here?
And as well, sorry, you should just say about the Zoom, there's an emoji function on the bottom of the screen. If you just raise your hand, Trevor Tomesh and Scott McCluskey are going to be keeping track of who's raising hands on Zoom. And I think we'll try to we'll take questions here and then see if there's any on Zoom that have emerged. And we have a mic here too, which, Matt, I assume you want people to talk into this mic. Okay. I'll do that.
Joan, like to speak. I think the mic just
It's just for the recording.
is just for the recording. You have to speak up so that we can hear you.
Well, I just thank you for coming. We're to favor guys so much. And so look my state. I just want to ask what I see happening at the University of Lethbridge is point that like right now there's a huge amount of violence and silencing of students contesting against the genocide in Palestine right now in the West. And I wanted similarities between the sides of those students who want to express their resistance to the genocide in Gaza, but what's happening to me, it's all part that counts feminism, free speech.
Sure. I think it's the same phenomenon in the sense of the idea that you have powerful interests in the universities who will react if they hear things that they dislike. It's kind of interesting, although it's a terrible situation, what's happening in Palestine. It has opened things up a little bit because it's generally what would be considered to be the woke element that's supportive of Palestine, and they're beginning to understand now the problems of academic freedom. So it's good in the sense that the fault lines that are supporting or opposing various positions are becoming a little bit more uncertain. So I'm hoping that it will alert people to the wider problem. Like, we need to support speech regardless of the position. That should be the principal position. But what you see is people often will support speech in cases where they agree with that speech, and then they will oppose speech in a case where they disagree with it. We need to move beyond that and just have supporting of people's ability to express their opinions.
Who's next? Is Trent here?
Yeah, so it is like, Prof.
Hi, isn't it a policy of the university in Lethbridge to make it don't they brag about being a safe place for everybody? Isn't that true? Isn't that the perception that they try to give people?
It wasn't too safe for Francis and I.
Yeah, I think that it wasn't. I also wonder if it would be safe for somebody for a student that maybe agreed with you and tried to make a comment about that in class. Would it be safe for an old white man like myself walking around? Because I can take a free class there, but would I be safe? Would it be safe for a young person when they have posters all over saying that if a woman claims to have been molested by a man, that the woman will be believed regardless? And I think a young person would feel quite unsafe hearing that message that they're not going to believe, but the person accusing would be believed. So it just doesn't seem like that's a appropriate. They claim to be a safe place. Like if you're a witch or something, you're going to be safe. If you're Indigenous, be safe. But to say it's safe for everybody doesn't sound like it's really something that they should be claiming as their actual position of the school.
According to Paul, what they're talking about at the university these days is the occupational health and safety. They don't talk about academic freedom. The idea is that, feedback. The idea is that, threw me off there. If you are made to feel threatened by ideas, if you are made to feel that somebody is harming the things that you believe in and that you want to stand up for and protect, that is a violation of that person. And we got to conduct ourselves in such a way that we don't get that. But of course, the hard reality is, you get to be an adult, and the world is a complicated place, and there are very different ideas, and there are risks in dealing with ideas and putting yourself on the line and taking unpopular positions, and that's kind of safety is being undermined in light of a much more superficial, fuzzy kind of view that somehow I should be able to feel secure in my position in the world, and I shouldn't be challenged. And anyway, so we have to sort of be mature. We have to be kind of adults and say sometimes free and open discussion, academic freedom is going to be difficult, and it's going to cause people to feel badly. But history is like that. History did all kinds of terrible things. If you can't talk about World War II or some aspect of World War II, and I think we all know what that aspect is, and make a law against it. And, we're going to put you in jail. And in fact, we're going to put you in jail for life through the Online Harms Act. If you dare talk about this thing. No, the Online Harms Act, who's behind it? Well, I could talk about that, but it's the Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs, as a matter of fact, that is pushing that. So we need to, be brave enough to talk our minds, to defy the system. If they're going to put us in jail for speaking what we see to be true and logical and fair-minded, so be it. I mean, it's almost like, here I am, and I've been through it's not pleasant to be a full tenured professor and asked to leave the campus and leave your students and be smeared in the media. It's not pleasant.
We get anybody online?
Not yet. Yeah, not yet.
Okay, we're working on getting some questions from our Zoom audience. Anybody here want to comment further?
How many of the professors are waking up at the university now? Are people catching on?
Well, I keep watching for something, some sign of life at the university, like throughout the whole coronavirus episode. Well, is somebody going to stand up and say, no, we don't want the mandates. We're not going to do it. They're not tested. People conformed. People accepted it. And the universities, in fact, when we look at Fauci with his billions of dollars to spend, a lot of that goes into universities. And so the universities have a vested interest in keeping certain industries happy and siding with certain powerful interests that have funding. It's, the virtual part of this, I thought it was ambitious. I would be just glad to see us talking in this environment. And it's hard to talk against your own voice up here, but why don't we just keep going with question and answer?
Sorry.
Here.
What?
Who's next?
If I could kind of have a 2-year-old question.
Yes, sir.
I see Francis.
Could you hold on a sec? We're getting a microphone to you.
Okay, line.
I'm just curious how it works at the university. Is it a public institution so people can book a room, and could they have an open discussion on a topic that may be controversial? Or does the university decide who is able to book a room and who can't? I don't know how it works.
Well, that's a very interesting question because it depends upon the university. And with respect to the University of Alberta, I just encountered this at the University of Alberta when I went up to speak there in January. Kathleen Lowry, who's a professor of anthropology there, invited me, and I believe she put in her request in October. So first of all, she asked her department chair if she could have the seminar room, and he wouldn't allow her to have the seminar room. And then so she went through the official channels. So you put it through a request. It used to be when I was at Mount Royal, you could just book a room. Like there wasn't a big bureaucratic infrastructure in place to determine this. You were a professor, so you booked a room. At the University of Alberta, which has become very corporate, they get you to do all these things. And in my case, they spent, I think it was 2 months vetting the request and went through all sorts of threat assessment types of processes. So this has become a big problem at universities, trying to control who's able to speak or not speak. And it depends on the university. But they're moving towards a much more bureaucratic side where you'll fill out a form, and then a number of administrators will analyze what you sent them and determine whether you will be allowed, the person you've invited will be allowed to speak or not.
In the statement of the Indigenous Studies Department, I'm quoting from it, Professor Widdowson, we deplore her having a platform at our campus. There's the phrase, our campus. This is coming from the Indigenous Studies Department. So who is included in our campus? And I have to say that, as I see it, the University of Lethbridge serves this community. And yet it's hard to get a focus on the University of Lethbridge because people don't think about it very much. It doesn't have much relevance to the things we want to discuss in the community. And, if the university is going to pick sides in, for instance, the residential school issue, and then say, you're only really able to come here and take part in the discussion if you agree with us, but we're not going to have alternative viewpoints. I mean, that's how you lose a sense of community involvement in your school. And, when I try to call attention to the fact that, the University of Lethbridge, people just don't care about it much anymore. They'd like to see if they have children there or relatives there, they'd like to see them succeed. But the idea that this is a place where we go with a sense of excitement because we can hear the issues of the day from, prominent people making news on all sides of the issue, we don't see much of that. So I'd say, is the University of Lethbridge doing its service to the community, doing its service to the people of Alberta, and we're diverse? Or is it just representing, it's notorious that this is the ace for the NDP in West Lethbridge, Shannon Phillips riding, that they can pretty much count on a big bunch of votes from the University of Lethbridge. And I think it's disreputable in a certain sense if a whole school or a public school system as well becomes, the perception is, well, this is a partisan institution. This is an NDP place. So, we would like to see a lot more effort to present an image of the University of Lethbridge that people of all persuasions could feel excited about watching what's going on there and maybe taking in a public lecture there and maybe seeing a really good debate between people who disagree on things like why not Leroy Littlebear and Dr. Widdowson having wouldn't it be great for the country, for all of us to see such a discussion? Or is it just an ivory tower where you just select who you're going to expose yourself to? And it's not a good situation right now.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I appreciate your, taking on complex issues and acknowledging that they're complex issues, right? There's more than just this is 100% right and this is 100% wrong. And I appreciate that you use your platform. Many of us don't have former tenure as professors, using that platform to make a difference. And I tend to be very much an optimist. One of the things I do is marital counseling, and I've seen some very broken, dysfunctional relationships. And I'm 60% optimist that this can move somewhere and 40% realist. This is going to be a lot of work. But because I've seen principles and practices breathe new life and they can move forward positively. You've touched on it in some of the other answers to the questions, but is there some specific examples that come to mind for your optimism that the university universities can be rescued, I guess.
Well, and it's part of a rescue of society, really, because, how do we perceive of what society is? And who's going to develop the big picture of how the different elements of society play themselves out amidst themselves, among themselves? And so, we look to universities to come up with some big picture analysis of what's going on. And we look to universities to have ideas about what other sectors in the society can do, the banks can do, the theaters can do, the movie theaters can do, the restaurants can do, the hospital can do. I mean, all of this, we look to the university as a place where we're going to get a rich array of observations and research and commentary about all the elements of our society. And, I just had a great life working at a university. And there was a long period of time where I really did feel I was able to talk about what I wanted to talk about, and I made a point of doing it. And it just happened like very quickly. Suddenly it just all froze up. And suddenly, and I jumped through all the hoops and got to the senior level and all of that. And suddenly the rules change. And no, you're not allowed to talk about this. What do you mean I'm not allowed to talk about this? And who are you to tell me I'm not allowed to talk about this? Who are you, Board of Governors? Who are you serving? Are you serving your own businesses on the Board of Governors? Are you doing, private deals and using that venue for your own advancement? Because I don't know where you are. I don't know who you are. You never justify yourself. You never show yourself in public. You get, I'm at the point where, why should I have to feel so exposed? Why should it all be on my shoulders? I'm not being, I've got a little pension. Yeah, I'm glad to get that. And damn it, I am Professor Emeritus from the University of Lethbridge. And after all that happened to me, somehow that's my status. I'm in good standing, and I feel like I want to stand on this platform within the University of Lethbridge and use this platform, as you say. Thanks.
And I should just mention, in terms of Mount Royal University, up until 2000, and I'm hoping people are hearing me on Zoom. Please let me know if you're not. We're having some audio problems on Zoom. Up until about 2014, things were very, very good at Mount Royal. Something happened around that period of time, and what was the most noticeable at Mount Royal University was indigenization. So in 2014, that's when we started on the process of indigenization. And then also, I noticed that the Canadian Association of University Teachers in 2014 did a seminar on equity, diversity, and inclusion, and how to bring that into the university. This is the most important area in Canada for protecting academic freedom. And at the time, I thought, why is CAUT giving this workshop on equity, diversity, inclusion? What's going on? So that was starting to happen. And for the future, what we need to do is make sure that universities don't have political statements. Universities should stay neutral on these political issues. And that's one of the battles that's being fought. And I believe it's University of Chicago. That's the kind of the origin of fighting back against the politicization of the universities. And hopefully with the Israel-Palestine kinds of problems, discussions that are going on, we will see more pressure for that. The danger, of course, is that they'll just further tighten the restrictions on speech, but really pressuring universities not to have political statements is a very, very important way of resisting what's going on.
Like, what do you mean by political statements? It's for the faculty to have debates and discussions about what is right and wrong. It's not for the administration to be deciding these issues. The university administration is to be in charge of an institution where these issues are fought out between the respective parties. But when the university itself and the administration itself starts to say, well, we're for this group and we believe in this slogan. Incidentally, this indigenization word, I think I'm very uncomfortable with how Francis uses it. To me, it's a very general word. It's kind of a good word. Like if I'm going to have a garden, maybe I want to have indigenous plants, and I want to at least know what are the indigenous plants or the indigenous animals. Maybe I'd rather see a buffalo around here than a cow. You know, the buffalo is kind of indigenous. And if you're not indigenous, if you're not for indigeneity, well, are you a globalist? Like we would like to see, you know, a sovereign Canada and a strong Alberta with the ability of us here in place to influence what happens rather than Trudeau just gets on the plane and goes off to Davos and our parliament just becomes a kind of, theater spectacle. We want an indigenous rooted society where we have a say, not a globalist society of technocrats off in somewhere, and it's all measured by how much money you have, and we just get no more opportunity to affect our own governments anymore. So we want, a local sovereignty, an indigenous sovereignty. So the indigenous peoples, and now that's a UN word. So what do you call the whole category of people around the world who've had people come on their lands and colonized? And that's a big group because there's the British Empire, there's the Portuguese Empire, there's the French Empire, there's the Spanish Empire, there's even the Belgian Empire, and on and on. And, they cut up the world among themselves, and people are just emerging from that even now and call them BRICS or whatever. So to me, the word colonization is a fine use of a word. Decolonization, it's actually a UN word. Like these countries that were colonies got their governments, an independent government in the 60s, in the 70s. It was a kind of decolonization process. But in fact, they're still colonized by banking regimes, by debt and credit regimes. So how we use these terms like Aboriginal peoples, well, that's in the Canadian Constitution. If you want to talk constitutional language in Canada, you have to use that. Who are the Aboriginal peoples? Indians, Inuit, and Métis. It's kind of, this myriad, this is part of our job as professors to explain these terms, rather than just use these terms and people can guess what we mean. So indigenous, but then indigenous, like the UNDRIP. I hear so much about the UN Declaration of Indigenous Peoples, which a lawyer at the University of Lethbridge Native American Studies, Russell Barsh, he had a great deal to do with writing that up. And now this UNDRIP has been used to say that Haida Gwaii, in British Columbia, out in the island there, is going to be governed by Indigenous people. But then there's a lot of people who are not Indigenous people who have land rights on Haida Gwaii. And, there's the fear that UNDRIP is going to be a tactic to dispossess us. And that fear is really real. And I don't think people might realize that came right out of the University of Lethbridge, Native American Studies Department. I saw it at the time. I was amazed. Wow, how were you able to pull this off? Get, a world global statement. It looked good to me at the time. But now whenever I raise the issue of Native issues, that's the first thing that comes into people's mind. UNDRIP, which seems like some kind of tool to dispossess people in the name of Indian rights or Indigenous people's rights.
Your question. We should have a Zoom question now. I'm not sure how we make that happen. Can you make that happen?
No, it's going to be
a fellow called Rocky.
Yeah, someone Rocky has said that he would like to ask a question on Zoom. So we'll try this out and see if it works. So Rocky, if you'd like to ask your question, hopefully it will work.
No. Going one.
Get your question.
Anyway, someone just said they wanted to ask a question, so we'll take another question from the audience.
Anyone else here?
Rosie.
Yep.
Sorry.
Rosie.
That under Ganya and Edward.
Russell Barsh.
Z.
B-A-R-S-H, I think.
Joan?
Yeah, I don't know. We talked to her a little bit, but I'm just very curious about
You think the so-called indigenization is part of this larger totalitarian agenda? Like, are they making the natives victims to be as part of the division, or what would you say is what directs this agenda? Like, I know it's anti-free speech, but I wonder if you could talk about that a little more.
Yeah, so this is a very complex area of examination, which is related to the wider kind of trend, which people have probably heard the term wokeism. So indigenization is part of wokeism, and the diversity. It's kind of interesting trying to look at diversity, inclusion, and equity, which is really comes out of the public administration developments of increasing the number of minorities on the boards of corporations, those kinds of initiatives. So there's that aspect, but then there's this what's called wokeism, which is where identity politics that purports to pursue social justice, and it's part of the LGBTQ types of initiatives, the anti-racism types of initiatives. This disability is now a big part of this, and this is to a large extent an assault on class politics. So that's part of the driver of it. And Norman Finkelstein has just written a book, which I haven't read yet, but I just received a copy of it, called I'll Burn That Bridge When I Get to It. And he's talking about what happened to him when he was participating in the Bernie Sanders campaign in the United States. And what happened is all the people who are most known for who would be most known as the woke kind of higher echelons. D'Angelo is one of the names. Imran X. Kendi, these kinds of names, they all basically took down Bernie Sanders because Bernie Sanders wasn't focusing enough on race, because Bernie Sanders was trying to develop a class-based coalition in the United States. So a lot of the woke kinds of impulse comes from anti-class politics, an anti-enlightenment agenda. Something else which Tony has alluded to, which it also relates to, and this comes out of, I'm just trying to think who else has talked about this, what authors, but it's a part of the capitalist class. So the international capitalist class, as opposed to the national capitalist class. International capitalist class is aligned with the social media companies, the banks, anything that's trying to accumulate profits through international orientation. Wokeism is aligned with that, and this is related to what Tony was talking about, which is UNDRIP, and generally the attack on Canadian sovereignty. So Indigenous sovereignty is an attack on Canadian sovereignty and is an attack on Quebec sovereignty. So the sovereigntist movement in Quebec in the 70s, a lot of the Indigenous nationhood kinds of arguments came out of the attempts to entangle Quebec in treaties that now it would have to be tied to Canada. So there's a lot of complex moving parts, but those are a couple of the factors which are driving it.
So Norman Finkelstein is a very important voice right now. He wrote a book about Gaza, and he also wrote a book called The Holocaust Industry. And when I see Francis and Albert Howard's Aboriginal industry, I can't help think that it's sort of a similar approach. So Norman Finkelstein He calls what's going on now the biggest assault on academic freedom in the history of the United States, because these many of them woke people who I think got cured of being woke by dealing with what's actually happening in Gaza and identifying with the shared humanity of the Palestinian people who are being slaughtered en masse and set up encampments and got organized very quickly. And then we saw the pushback. They're treated as criminals. They're gangs of thugs that go and beat them up. They're arrested. They appear on a Canary Mission, where I appear. It's a blacklisting site to ruin people's career opportunities. It's a Zionist site. So what has happened is that the big donors of the universities, Harvard and these schools, they are actually saying, we're not going to keep the money flowing unless you do what we tell you. We want Jewish faculty and students to be comfortable. We want to have an influence on the curriculum. We want to have an influence on who gets hired and who doesn't. And take it or leave it. We can do other things with our money. And so the universities are being taken over on the basis of this issue. And this situation in Gaza, which is, it's starting to spark what is looking like this developing civil war. We're all sliced and diced into so many factions and competing groups. This whole thing going on in the Middle East, Western Asia, is having a huge impact on our society. And as I say, the academic freedom issue is given great prominence by none other than Norman Finkelstein.
So we have a question from Zoom, which is from Rocky, who asks the question, how many professors refused to take the vaccine at the university?
Top one.
I'll let Tony answer that one.
Well, Josh, you told me that in order to be at the university, you had to take 2 jabs and a indoctrination course in gender issues. Is that not right?
Right. And they strategically did that. The deadline was the middle of the semester, and they said if you don't submit your 2 doses, they would take your classes and say you can't enter register for any more classes, and also you can never get to graduate. So that's basically a roundabout way of saying you're all expelled unless if you what kind of same thing when the in some kind of sexual violence training. I didn't take the course, so I'm not allowed to take it or classes would be gruesome for now. And that's the way that's simply they're adding new things all the time. They're adding more barriers for you to jump through.
Do you think there's actually some professors who were fired because they wouldn't take the jab?
They basically did. So imagine that everybody was on board.
I was watching for some sign of, just discussion and debate about it at that time. And I just couldn't see any sorry about that. Should have given you a chance to get the microphone. I just couldn't see any sign. Like, I'm looking for life at the University of Lethbridge. I'm looking for something going out on a large scale, some big thinking, somebody really willing to take a stand on something like, no, I'm going to refuse the jabs, and if you're going to fire me, you're going to do so very publicly, and I'm going to talk about it, and I just don't see that kind of willingness to take chances at the University of Lethbridge.
And just for a note, because the people on Zoom can't hear people speak unless you have the mic. So just make sure if you're going to, so go ahead. Maybe you, Josh, you could just repeat what you said.
Okay, yeah. So, for everybody on Zoom, I was just mentioning that the University of Lethbridge in October 2021, they sent an email to all the students and said, if you don't submit your 2, first of all, you had to download the Lethbridge U-Safe app on your smartphone, where there would be a QR code there for security to scan whenever you walk into the building, if there was somebody present there. And they said, if you don't submit your 2 doses of vaccine, the proof of the 2 doses, that you would be first of all, pulled out of your classes, you were barred from enrolling in any classes, and then they would say, you're not ever allowed to graduate. And then, of course, I also mentioned that there was sexual violence training course that you had to take, otherwise you wouldn't be able to enroll in any more classes, and it was the same deal. Like, you're basically expelled unless you do that. Okay, but I had a question first. I will say, you mentioned about being exposed for your beliefs and for speaking out. And I think at this point in the year 2024, the culture war has been pretty well going for long enough that people are starting to think about it now. For the longest time, it seemed like what we would describe as the wokeists, they have been so-called winning the conflict because most people don't really understand what's going on in the first place. They don't understand that there is a conflict. But now people, maybe you already mentioned, Tony, that the conflict in Gaza is probably maybe a wake-up call for many of the folks who are on that side. And at the university, it's not so obvious to me that there's a push in a different direction quite yet. But in terms of turning the tide, generally speaking around the country, people do seem to be not so much backing the wokeists anymore. Like, for example, in the soon upcoming federal election, it seems like mostly everybody who's politically engaged in this country, they are going to be backing the conservatives instead of the liberals for the first time in almost a decade. And so my question to the panel perhaps is, in any other way outside the university, do you see the tide in the culture war turning in other ways?
I definitely see it on the trans issue is happening. So with respect to trans activism, a couple of years ago, it was really looking like if you didn't want to call people they, them with those pronouns, you could find yourself in a human rights tribunal. Now with the I'm not sure if people have heard about these two reports coming out of the UK. I think they came out of the UK. One is the WPATH files. Mia Hughes is the author. The other is the Cass report. And what they're finding, and this is an example of why pursuing the truth is so important in universities, because, and this is a term that has been used, which I think is very, very important for wokeism, the cry bullies, the unbelievable cry bullies who do these horrible kind of totalitarian things, and then when you react against them, they revert to their perceived oppressed status and say that you are actually reacting against them. Anyway, the trans activists are just the most notorious of the cry bullies. Anyway, they have just been acting in a terrible totalitarian fashion and have been intimidating everyone. And because of that, there have been horrible things done to a whole bunch of young people who were somewhat, maybe autistic, maybe had sexual orientation concerns. Anyway, they have people now who have been mutilated in various ways and are now, just coming to recognize what's happened. And this has now been documented in the WPATH files and the Cass report. And we are going to have a reckoning on this terrible situation that has been unfolding. I guess it's been going on for the last, maybe 5 years. But there's a lot of harm that has been done because people who are trying to raise the alarm were severely punished for it. And people who saw that happen just kind of step back. And so we now have a public health, kind of scandal, a serious public health healthcare scandal. But that's turning. That's going to turn. Who knows? There could be. This is the thing that goes on is you see some hope in that people are pushing back against it, and one hopes that then there'll be a sort of a rethinking about these things, and we'll have an opening up of the discussion. But what you could see is just a remobilization of these kinds of autocratic forces, which just crack down harder on what's going on. So it's not quite clear what is going to result from that, but I think that I have seen some movement on that. As well, the unmarked graves, which we've been working on, a research group and myself have been working on since 2021, 3 years. And Nina Green, who is the researcher, has been sending out mass emails to journalists and politicians for years, we see a little bit of change in the province of Quebec. So Quebec is one of the hopeful signs in Canada because Quebec is not as woke as English Canada. So some of the journalists are more hardcore journalists and not being intimidated by this kind of dynamic. So there's been some articles published in the province of Quebec which are critical of the whole kinds of what is really a hysteria that unfolded in 2021 about the unmarked graves.
Well, speaking of mutilation, the jabs, billions and billions of jabs have been given around the world. There was nothing like this ever before. 2/3 of the people on the planet have this jab. Some of them were coerced into taking it, like you were coerced into taking it. And, I'm interested to find what do you think about that? How do you feel about that? But, now we have a great deal of documentation that when you look at it on a worldwide basis, there are millions and millions, maybe tens of millions of people who have already died, people who are very sick. This is one of those censored subjects that you're not supposed to raise. And it's kind of gross to think that, something of this scale happens in our midst. And we're compelled to say, oh boy, I guess the COVID shots saved 20 million lives, as you hear in some places. Will those people, when you start to lose your family, when you are facing a lifetime of, an agonizing slow death, these things happen and they are being suppressed in this censorious milieu that we live in. And it's grotesque. And, is this, like we talk about those people who kept quiet about the Holocaust and all of that? I mean, what are we living through right now ourselves? And what are we facilitating by sort of agreeing not to make a big deal of it and be silent about it and to keep our jobs and keep our positions and not ruffle feathers? So there's so many consequences to the things that are being done to us, in the banking scale. Who knows what is in our food, what is in our air? How do we navigate all of this and find time to organize, to face the incredible power of the cabal that is pulling all of this together? Who are they? What's going on at the World Health Organization and the effort to make, that part of the UN have control over future pandemics and be able to declare emergencies? And what about the role of somebody like Bill Gates can just go in and buy up the World Health Organization? I thought you would think the UN would not just be like that, just sell itself to the highest bidder, but apparently it is. So you just wonder, at what point do people engage? And maybe we just have to resolve ourselves that we're going to be 10, 15%, but 10 or 15% of people in the world can still have a big impact. We just got to find a way to organize.
Question at the back. Josh, can you take the mic back there?
See what we can on saying after that.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Hall. I totally agree with you about the vaccines. I'm a U of L student, and I wrote the university administration many times about the vaccines. And I have an email from, I believe it was the president's secretary, was Mike Whipple, I can't remember his name, and he said that the vaccines do not stop transmission of the virus. He said that in an email.
Yeah.
So, and I mean, it really angers me that, there was...
He's already...
There should have been way more backlash about the vaccines. These things are killing people. They are destroying lives. And nobody wants to do anything about it. And the university, they were just, they were vicious.
So when you admit, as has been admitted, that these injections don't have any effect in stopping spread, and they don't stop infection. In fact, it seems that people who get these injections get a higher rate of COVID-19, so-called COVID-19. if it wasn't to stop transmission, what was it for? It had nothing to do with stopping a virus. It's a genetic modification. mRNA, lipid nanoparticles, is to change our genes to, we don't like genetically modified food. Now we've got genetically modified people. And why do they want to do that? What intentions do they have for us? And now as people get turbo cancers from all of these injections, now they're going to do mRNA lipid nanoparticle injection, which isn't a vaccine, for the turbo cancers, as if this is the key now. They've changed the whole system of medicine to make genetic modification the way you deal with things. And they never told us. They never explained it to us. And where are the university professors who have a good, sweet deal with tenure, with good pay, with cushy conditions? Where are they to explain these things to us?
Yeah, they pushed it on everyone, the professors, the students, and there were a few professors I know they were either laid off or fired. 2 of them were brought back, but yeah, they just, it was an awful situation. So thank you for talking about this, because we're not hearing about it.
Okay, we have a couple of questions from Zoom. The first one,
When I see it.
is from Daniel Page, and it's about how much does woke corporatism interrelate with the University of Lethbridge situation? Some schools are rampantly facing this issue, as seen with what happened to him. So he got pushed out of the University of Regina with respect to, I believe, a diversity, inclusion, and equity types of demands. So that's from Daniel. And the second one, which we can just include, and we can answer both or one of them, whichever. And that is from Rocky again. And I just had his question. I'm just looking. I had the... sorry, I just missed it. Oh, it was about whether professors are ostracized for defending the pro-Palestinian position, whether professors are being ostracized for that. So one is about woke corporatism, and the other one is about whether professors are ostracized for taking a pro-Palestinian position. So I'll do the woke corporatism one. So that is what wokeism is about. Like, it's interesting because people are probably familiar with the authors like Douglas Murray and James Lindsay, who see wokeism as communism or coming out of the Marxist types of literature. And there's a little bit of truth to that, in that the people who started off that trend were operating within a Marxist kind of framework initially, but I don't think what they were arguing, which became wokeism, has anything to do with class politics or the productive forces. It has nothing to do with the economics. But woke corporatism is where you have demands being made on corporations. So corporations, especially the social media companies, also the banks. If you go into the bank, at least when I go into a bank in Calgary, you'll just be hit by wokeism all over the place. So you'll have the pride flags all over the place, and you'll have the territorial land acknowledgements, and they're, constructing all their advertisements to, have various minorities being represented in various contexts. So this again is, instead of focusing on the conflicts between the owners of what's called the means of production, which is, Bill Gates or Jeff Bezos or, all the people who are billionaires, and the people who work for their companies, there's going to be a big conflict. And Norman Finkelstein talks about this in his book. There's going to be a strike at Amazon. That's going to happen. So whose side are the woke people going to be on there? The woke corporatism is courting, all these minorities that have nothing, which could, in some ways, do have alignments with class politics, but often they don't. They're like sort of the privileged elements of these minorities. They're courting that, which then is at best a distraction from the kinds of economic difficulties that many people are facing. Like, there's terrible economic difficulties, but instead of worrying about that, you know, we're talking about, like, which I think is the silliest of all the stuff, pronouns. Like, what, you know, pronouns, like, you, as Matt Walsh says, you know, you don't have a right to your pronouns. Like, it's like me saying, every time you refer to me, you've got to say the amazing and brilliant Francis Widdowson or something. Like we have adjectives, we have pronouns, they're generic part of the language. So how did we get all obsessed about this kind of not a very important part? And then, you know, demanding that people call you they. If you people think you're a woman or a man, it's going to be very difficult for them to refer to you as they. And then there's all this upset and offense because, you know, oh, you've been misgendered and this is terrible. You know, meanwhile, there's terrible inflation and people having a hard time, you know, getting their groceries to feed their families. Like, this is not the, you know, most serious issue. So woke corporatism is trying to make the corporations look good by having all these symbols that they engage in, and in the meantime, they're, you know, sort of distracting people from the main kind of conflict which is looming in society.
Good.
So, Tony, how about you answer? There's the rocky question about the are professors ostracized for supporting the Palestinian cause?
Well, I haven't, you know, been teaching since 2016. I go occasionally to the University of Lethbridge, but I really don't have a take on that. But on the question of the gender issues, I mean, it seems that we did a fairly decent job from my perspective that, okay, people are homosexuals, they want to have partnerships, fine, you know, whether gay or lesbian, or bi. What is new, though, is the trans part of it. And the idea of transforming schools into platforms where you try to identify those, you know, who's going to be the one who says, well, my name's Tim, but I really want to be called Jane. And, oh, there, you know, move in on that kid. And using the schools as a platform to introduce them then to surgeons, and you can get the hormones here, and then school becomes a place where this takes priority, you know, and then what kind of partner are you going to want once you do this, once you have this surgery, and you know, this seems like such a robbery of schools. And why is it happening? Why is BlackRock Corporation wanting this, for instance? Who stands to gain from this? I mean, this seems pretty clear. It's an attack on family. It's an attack on whatever cohesiveness we can muster in society, with the family unit being, you know, core to it. Because these kids who go through the gender transformation, how are they going to? What kind of families are they going to create? So why destroy the families? What's the agenda behind this? I mean, why inject us with stuff that is depopulating us? Why? Like, what, you know, and coming up with the conclusion, they seem to want to kill us. You know, especially Caucasian Christian people, you know, seem to be the target. And why? Who's behind this? Who stands to gain from this? It's just astonishing to think. And this whole thing about, you know, well, you can't tell the parents because they will be, you know, they will try to prevent their children from becoming who they really want to be deep down inside. And so, you know, you alienate, and, you know, just the idea that you change your name from Tim to Jane. Well, the parents gave them the name Tim. You don't choose your own name. Your parents give you your name. And what's this attack on parenthood? Why?
Big questions. Shell?
So, first my comment, then my question. So my comment is, like,
as a parent who has children. One is currently in university and has jumped through the hoops and has a year left. But my youngest daughter is graduating high school next year and looking at where she'd like to go for university in her academic career with ambitions to be a teacher. She is a very strong critical thinker with, I guess you could say that she really likes to question authority and not want to fall in line with all these things. She's not jabbed. She doesn't believe all the wokeism, and academic freedom would be very important to her. Is there any university other than the University of Lethbridge that might be a better option for her? Or is there any chance you think that things may change in the next year to make it a better place for her where she won't have to be all jabbed up? And the second part of my question is where Tony said, the community's not really involved with the university. What can we do as community members and parents to get more involved, to be more involved, and to make it a place where we do want to send our children or to attend ourselves to learn and to achieve academically?
Well, one thing I might start with is it would have been possible for some people in the administration to come here to hear this, to hear the discussion in the community about how people feel about that university. Where is the willingness to engage in this kind of discourse? And why shut us out like this? Why be so contemptuous that you think we have nothing to offer, and that you have all the answers, and you're doing a excellent job, and why?
You might look into Athabasca University.
I think there's pockets of universities. So anything like Indigenous studies, gender studies, anything like that, don't do that. But there are some disciplines, and this is the social sciences. I think that the biology and chemistry and so on, I don't think they're
completely contaminated, although biology has some problems. But in terms of the social sciences and humanities, philosophy, there's still a lot of hope in philosophy. In the Society for Academic Freedom and Scholarship, some of the best contributors to academic freedom discussions and critical thinking and those sorts of discussions are philosophers. Economics has some parts of it which are quite scientifically oriented. And psychology, some of the parts of psychology, there's some, so this sort of needs a bit of investigation to look at the kinds of, I would say the programs are almost more important than the university as a whole. But I think philosophy still has some very, very important thinkers that have not been completely mowed over by postmodernism in that regard. So we have a question from Janice Tange, or Tange, I'm not sure. Sorry, Janice, if I pronounced your name incorrectly. I'm just trying to, I have a really difficult time with my chat thing here.
Make it clear.
No,
this one.
Here, like it? Okay, maybe I'm going to be okay. I'm trying to.
And then you get hit the square.
Hit the square, okay. Oh, there we go. I was just trying to read this on this tiny screen. So Janice's question is, given the indoctrination of children in elementary school into the Native narrative, including things known to be false, such as the orange shirt story, how can it come to pass that the indigenization of universities doesn't continue down the same path it is on? Those children will bring it to the university and then be future teachers and professors. Yes. Tony, I'm not sure if you want to, I think this is a problem. I guess we hopefully at some point are going to have a reckoning in the universities so that we can restore critical thinking as part of our mandate. How we do that is a difficult question, because it's and this sort of follows through with what Janice is talking about, is that in, I think it was 2009 to 2014, starting then, we had a huge number of professors who were hired in the universities, and all the older professors are retiring. So the whole nature of the academic underpinnings of the institution now have been shaped by the personalities of the people who are hired, who unfortunately, say things like science is an oppressive method, and science is a white supremacy type of, way of doing things, this kind of thing. So it's not going to be an easy process. I'm not trying to pretend that this is going to be an easy process, but there are some things that can be done, such as stopping the political statements, insisting on merit-based hiring is another one, not hiring according to diversity quotas, which is happening all across the country. As Daniel Page, who was on, asked a question earlier, he's documented a lot of this for computer science advertisements. Like, why is there a concern about the sexual orientation of people hired in computer science? Like, how is that going to help improve the level of computer science research and teaching? All these kinds of identity characteristics. So, so I don't know what the answer to that is, but it definitely is kind of a problem. And also, Janice is hinting at, we have a much bigger problem than just the universities. Like, we have a problem in the elementary schools, a problem in the teachers, colleges, and what kinds of instruction that teachers are getting. So it's kind of a part of a wider conversation.
Larry, I saw you with a microphone.
Thank you, Jeff. Brilliant comments. You strike something in me. You ask why the distractions, the injections, the eliminations of freedoms, that kind of thing. Very important questions. I spent a lifetime in the financial industry, and I have two words for why I believe those things are coming about. The two words are farming humans. And from someone in the financial industry, that's a $1 billion question. I'm sorry, it's a $1 trillion question. And that's my comment. And again, forgive me for inserting that term in there, because I'm very connected to that, or I have a very strong belief in that kind of human enslavement, financial, social, political control, everything, medical. Thank you for putting this on. I'm honored to be here.
Well, thank you, Larry Alford. Larry Alford writes books. Larry Alford started in the Lethbridge Herald as a financial advisor, and he started being critical of the industry, some of the exploitive aspects of being financial advisors. And anyway, he went head-to-head with the Royal Bank of Canada, standing up for his principles. And he's a very important person in Lethbridge here. He's our neighbor, and he comes to our Thursday night events where Dave, comes as well. Anyway, so Larry, I'll return the acknowledgement of the important work that you do, and for years I come and visit you next door and talk about my frustrations. And Larry at one point had a big role in the Southern Alberta Council on Public Affairs. I think Penny, you still do. Penny is, Larry would say his better half. We did go to the, when Christine Anderson was speaking to the truckers, she was invited to Calgary at the Petroleum Club. And it was, very nice to see this European Union parliamentarian who had called Trudeau, nasty names and said, you're a dictator and you don't deserve to be in this democratic forum. And then Polyev, under pressure from the Israel lobby, said, well, she's a Nazi and she's not welcome in Canada. And, well, where did he come up with that? Who told him to say that? Why would they tell him to say that? And, we see in different countries, there's a few parliamentarians in the European Parliament. There's Ron Johnson in United States. There's a fellow in Britain who is a dissident voice. But our parliament, we really have none of that. Our parliament is very scripted, very contained within a narrow range of issues. And the kind of questions that I'm trying to raise, I can't see any real role for this, any discussion in Parliament on these kinds of issues. And it's easy to, think Trudeau is to blame for everything. He's kind of a goof, but it's, it's much bigger than him. And he's just a servant of, well, the people at Davos and the people above them, because it's, it goes up to the banks, it goes up to the military. Anyway, so thanks, Larry.
So we have a question on Zoom, and we're going to try something fancy now, which is for Scott to, Scott McCluskey wants to ask a question, and Scott can unmute himself and ask the question. And hopefully that will work.
He Francis, the presentation, I really enjoyed it. He said, that's everybody else, all good one folk.
Turn it up.
My question,
if you can just raise your voice as high as you can, Scott, because you're a little bit low.
Yeah, I'm stating like, so here's the first of all, study is this in a civil litigation of the damages, the negligence, malice, and sorry. These has to be offered in court or downside. Okay, now, why do you think to be business the same legal scattered in their past race claims before? He just take out hundreds of millions of dollars.
So the question for people who didn't hear that is, in terms of litigation about the graves, the claims about the graves, why don't we hold Indigenous groups to the same standard in terms of seeking damages from them for what they've caused by the false claims? Is that correct, Scott?
Is the Indigenous are saying, in essence, that they did pretty negligently with malice, there's been genocide, then generally courts does the bigger probably those rights of the law. They claim as we don't the claimant. So my question is, why do you think we don't need Indigenous the same standard? How do you still pay out hundreds of millions of dollars with government legal on the next debate?
Yes. So why isn't there a demand for evidence to be provided about the burials before the money is paid out? So usually you would find that happening. Well, this has been sort of the history of these disputes now for, I guess, going on about 50 years. And it's, my own view is it's a placating exercise. So the reason is to placate rather than to address the problems. So no one would deny that there are terrible problems facing many isolated Indigenous communities. So that is recognized as a huge problem, and we're constantly sort of talking about that. How will the dispersal of hundreds of millions of dollars for these claims about the graves do anything to address that? What it does is it basically buys off the leadership for a certain amount of time. So the leadership is, making arguments. The leadership is connected to all sorts of legal types of players within the Aboriginal industry type of system. And this dispersal of funds is a way for the government to say, we're doing something about these terrible problems, when it doesn't really do anything to solve the problems, and just, in fact, creates more and more resentment about the treatment that Indigenous people are receiving. So we're in this kind of loop where we have been sold the position that in order to solve Indigenous problems, money should be dispersed to Indigenous leaders. That's basically what goes on. Nothing is solved. The problems continue, and then we repeat. This will continue until we say, first of all, this whole clandestine burials issue, there's nothing to it. It's all been fabricated. And it's hard to believe that this has happened. But, when you bring down your fist on everyone who says something about it, and, I've seen this firsthand, and I continue to see it, and everyone's sort of afraid to go into it. And this has been happening for 3 years. You have no ability to have any check. There's no democratic check on the things that are happening. So hopefully with the May 27th anniversary that's coming up, we'll see what is going to be the new discussion, if there is a new discussion. But, how long can it go on for? It's not something that is honest. Like, that's the thing I think that makes me the most angry about everything that's happening, is that I know that there are a number of Indigenous people who are really angry at me, and I see that, and I try to engage with them, and if it's not easy to do, but I hope in the end they can appreciate that I was at least trying to be honest with them. I had enough respect for them that I wasn't just going to pat them on the head and say, oh, yes, you had these terrible, all these murders happened, and because you say so, I'm sorry. If we are going to be a society, if we're going to be a democracy, we need to be able to talk honestly with one another, and there is no honest discussion at all that is happening with respect to Indigenous, non-Indigenous relations. So, I'm hoping in the next few months, we might have a little bit more honesty, but it's hard to tell which way. With these things, you never know which way it's going to go. But it's because of condescension and placation. That's why we don't have accountability.
And thank you, Bill. Last bit.
Thanks.
We've had a good discussion, and we've raised some good issues. I think our time is about up. But Paul, I see you sitting at the back thinking. You've played a role in this. I wonder if you have anything to say.
No, I don't right now.
All right. Well, let's give a round of applause to our two speakers here. Dr. Widdowson and Dr. Garratt.
And I just wanted to thank our audience on Zoom. It was a bit of a rough ride for them. I realize we're trying to iron out these technological difficulties, and we had moments where everything was muted and no one could hear anything. And I hope I was able to deal with the questions that everyone asked. If you would like to send me or Anthony Hall any kinds of questions, if you can. I'm not sure how to my email address is widdowsonfrancis@gmail.com, and I'd be happy to answer any further questions that people have. Thanks for coming.
Good for us for pulling this off. Thanks for coming.
Yes. Thank you for coming.